I don't see your hand.
Bring it up just a little bit.
Come on, how do you do that?
I'll crouch down.
No, seriously. What do you do?
Sharon's going to get it set up there. It's okay.
Thank you,
It's
Sharon.
okay. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 18 this morning. And just in case you've missed a couple weeks, I want to just spend about 30 seconds or so catching us up to where we're actually at this morning. And it takes us back a couple weeks, because a few weeks ago we talked a little bit about comparison. And one of the things that we said is that we have a culture that encourages us to compare ourselves to one another and compare ourselves to people around us, whether they're people online or whether they're people in the room with us. And what we said is that never ends up being a good thing for us. Because as we look around at people, we either see people that are more gifted or better at something than we are, and so we feel insignificant, we feel unaccomplished, we feel like we can never make a difference or never do anything impactful for the Lord because, why wouldn't God use them, or why wouldn't God use him or her, because they're just so much better than I am. And here's the thing, is that kind of a mindset never honors God. Because God can use all of us, and God does use all of us with our gifts and with our abilities. And the second thing about comparison is we look at other people, and the other thing that can happen is we see people that are not as good as you are, not as good as I am at a particular thing or a particular ministry or a particular task. And so the other danger is we sort of look around and see everything that's happening around us, is that we start to think of ourselves as superior or better or more useful to God than him or her or that person, or we just see that. And the thing is, that doesn't honor God as well. That doesn't honor God either, because God doesn't want us to think of ourselves less than we are, because he can do anything he wants with us. And God also doesn't want to think of ourselves as superior or better, because that's just pride. And so that's where we were a couple weeks ago. We're going to pick up on one of those themes this morning as well. In chapter 17 is like the most famous Bible story in the Bible, and it's the story of David when he goes out to fight the giant Goliath. And you remember that story. And what we said that week was that David's belief or David's faith in God's faithfulness took him out onto the battlefield to fight this giant Goliath. And because David had faith in God's faithfulness, God honored David, God honored that faith, and this giant Goliath was defeated, and the Philistines took off and headed for the hills because they were afraid. And it's in chapter 17, at the very last verses, that we start to pick up the story. And so we're going to be reading here a little bit. And I want to start in chapter 17 and verse 53. Chapter 17 of 1 Samuel and verse 53. Just take a look at the text with me this morning. The sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camp. So the Philistines are gone, they're running. Israel chases them for a bit, and now they come back and take all their stuff. It says that David took the Philistines' head, that's Goliath's head, and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. Now when Saul saw David going out against the Philistines, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this young man?" And Abner said, "By your life, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "You inquire whose son the youth is." So David returned from killing the Philistine. Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." Now you may remember, if you're just keen and you remember things and you pay attention, that David spent some time serving Saul just a few chapters back. That apparently is quite a few years back now, maybe 5 or 6 or 7. David's changed quite a bit because Saul doesn't recognize David. And he's informed that it's David, the son of Jesse, who has killed this giant Goliath. chapter 18 in verse 1 says, "Now when it came about that he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself." Now this is a very interesting verse. "Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt." Now David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered, and David set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people, also in the sight of Saul's servants. So let's just stop there for a moment, because there's some things to comment on here. You know, one of the first questions that ought to pop into our heads as we sort of read the story and start to filter through it a little bit is how is David's success going to translate? How is David's success going to affect him as a person? Because all of a sudden, like within an instant, David goes from nobody knows who he is, nobody knows, who's this young boy, Jesse, we don't really even know who Jesse is, to being a household name. I mean, David was in every coffee shop conversation for the next 3 weeks. He's gone from like being a nobody to an overnight sensation. And if you might remember, Saul, at the very beginning of his kingship, and just a little bit before that, Saul had an attitude. Saul was a man that seemed to hold a lot of promise, a lot of potential. And yet when he became king, something changed in him. At first, he was a man that would listen to God, but yet when he became king, something changed within Saul. And Saul decided he was going to go his own path, his own way, because after all, he was king. And so one of the questions that we're asked to be thinking about as we read this is, how is this going to affect David? We know that he is a young man, maybe 18, 19, 20 at this point. We know that he loves the Lord, but is this going to change it in any way? Because now he's like the guy on the rise. Now he's the person that everybody knows, everybody's talking about. And it's interesting that initially Saul loved David as well. Why wouldn't you? I mean, David became Saul's ally. They're going off to war together. This is like the man with the golden touch. Nothing could go wrong with David by his side. And so Saul instantly recognizes the potential here, and he says, "David, there's no way you're going home and tending sheep. You're going to stay with me. And we will go out and we will fight the Philistines together, and you will be my secret weapon. And with me on your left side and you on my right side, we are going to be this awesome tag team that is just going to destroy and defeat our enemies, the Philistines." And so Saul just sort of takes David under his wing, and Saul is like a mentor to David, as David is sort of learning what it means to be a man of war and to lead the king's armies into war. And it talks about that in verse 5. And it's also interesting in verse 4, and I don't want to skip over this because this is so incredible. It says in verse 4, we read it there, that Jonathan took all of his armor, he took his robe, and he stripped those things off him, and he handed them to David. Now that is absolutely incredible. What Jonathan is doing here in verse 4 is symbolic. What Jonathan is doing in verse 4 is saying to David, I am setting aside my right, my chance, my legacy, my opportunity to be king, and I'm handing it to you, David. Think about that for a moment. Now, we know that God had told Saul that none of his descendants would reign after him. But what we don't know is if Saul had told Jonathan this. And even if Jonathan did know that God had told Saul, perhaps Jonathan is thinking, maybe there's a way, maybe there's an opportunity, maybe there's a chance that God would change his mind. And the strongest claim to the throne was a blood claim. I mean, if you were a descendant of the king, it was usually the closest blood relative sit after dad or sometimes mom passed away. The next closest relative, blood relative to them, had the strongest claim to the throne. And that would have been Jonathan. That would have been Jonathan. And in fact, this is so incredible that he would do this. It actually led some people to believe, this story couldn't actually be true, because nobody in their right mind would do this. And in fact, this is so important that when kings would become kings, often the first thing that they would do, and this is brutal and it's awful, but the first thing that they would do is eliminate any rival to their claim to the throne. So if they had a half-brother, a half-sister, if they had an uncle who had an eye on taking their spot, anybody that had any sort of claim to the throne, often as soon as they became king or became queen, they would just eliminate them. They're gone, because we don't want anybody challenging, anybody raising up an army, anybody with any sort of a claim to my position. And so the way of thinking, of course, in those times was you take whatever power you can get and you seize it with all your might, and then you eliminate, you kill, you get rid of anybody that has any possibility of ever seizing or taking that power away from you. And Jonathan, who's next in line to King Saul, with nothing to gain, with no, this isn't a trade-off, he doesn't get anything back, says to David, he says, I see you. I see that God is working in your life. I see that God is going to do something with you. And you have a lot of potential, that God is using you. And I am going to relinquish my claim to the throne. And I'm going to hand that claim to you, David. And if anybody had anything to lose, from David's rise, from David's increased popularity, the one, I guess I should say, that had the most to lose, it was Jonathan. It was Jonathan. And Jonathan in verse 4 says, you know what, I just don't care. I'd rather see it done God's way. I'd rather see it, God in this. I'd rather sort of step back and respond to this with humility than to get in the way of what God is doing. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. And so he takes all these things, and symbolically, he gives them to David. And symbolizing that he sees that God has chosen David as the next king. So David is symbolically given the leadership role. Saul takes David under his wing and kind of mentors him and helps him along. And they're fighting wars together. And it's interesting in verse 6, this is where things start to take a turn. This is where things start to go bad for David. And if you've ever thought to yourself, all I have to do is follow God and do what's right and do as I'm supposed to do, and everything is just going to turn out fine, it doesn't always work out that way. Because after David does the right thing, after David defeats the giant, things actually go from good and really good to really bad for David. Look at verse 6. It says this. Now it happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, the women came out to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy and musical instruments. And the women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000. It all starts right in verse 6. It's just a song. I mean, everybody's excited. Everybody's thrilled. Israel went from almost certain defeat on the battlefield to this incredible victory. And as was the custom, all the women came out and they're singing songs. And the soldiers are coming back from war. And the song went something like this. Saul has slain his thousands. I mean, Saul, what a warrior he is. And that must have made Saul feel really good. Until he heard the next line, and it says, David has slain tens of thousands. And it's interesting because it likely wasn't even true. I mean, Saul most likely had fought in many more battles than David and killed many more of the enemy than David. But something in verse 6 just caught Saul the wrong way. kingdom. Something in verse 6 just planted a seed of envy and jealousy and anger in the heart of Saul. And what is so sad, I think about this, is that David went from being an ally to King Saul. Somebody that Saul could trust on, somebody that could be of great benefit to Israel, somebody that God was with. David went from being the ally to the enemy of King Saul. And after verse 6, it was never quite the same again. Look what it says there. Let's pick up in verse 8. Chapter 18 and verse 8, it says, Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? That's an interesting statement. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. You know what happens? As Saul saw how others were looking at David, as Saul saw how others ascribed to him tens of thousands of kills on the battlefield and what a hero he was for his nation, Saul looked at David and looked at himself and says, you know what? He's gunning for my job. You know, he wants what I have. He wants my power. He wants my position. He won't hesitate to get rid of me. He won't hesitate to make a move if he sees an opportunity. What place is there for David to go but up in ranks? He wants my kingdom. And in fact, there's no indication that David did want Saul's kingdom. David, at this point, has said or done nothing wrong. But Saul just gets a seed of jealousy, the seed of envy. As he compares himself to David, he says, David is after my job. And it says he looked at David with suspicion from that day on. And folks, we need to watch out for that. Pastors need to watch out for that. People that are working in workplaces, leading teams in workplaces, you need to watch out for that, because you will be most successful. You will find the most success as you surround yourself with people that are gifted, people that have great abilities, people that are being used by God, people that are developing their gifts. That is where you will find yourself the most successful. But you know what the scary part about that is for leaders? It's simply this. When you surround yourself with people that are gifted, you will surround yourself with people that are more gifted than you. And there's always that fear. There's always that fear that, maybe they're a better preacher than I am, and if I give them an opportunity, nobody's going to want to hear from me anymore. Maybe they're more talented than I am, and so I'm just going to sort of control this and control their environment and sort of squash their giftedness so that they really can't use it to its full potential. Because I am afraid that if I set them free, if I allow God to use them to their fullest potential, that all of a sudden I will become irrelevant. I will become useless. Nobody will want me in this role anymore. And David, as Saul sees everything that's happening in his life, he says, you know what? He's going for my job. He's trying to be king. He's trying to take my kingdom. And so therefore, I will never, ever, ever, ever trust David again. And that's where it all started. It started with a song. It started with a seed that was planted. And Saul just sort of allowed that to take root and to grow. And things went from bad to worse in Saul's heart. And if you go down through the rest of the chapter, down through the rest of chapter 18, you will see that on two occasions, Saul was so jealous and so envious and so angry that David was doing well, that twice he tried to pin him to a wall with a spear, and David managed to escape without being harmed. On another occasion, Saul said to David, hey, part of the deal for killing the giant was that I would give you one of my daughters to take in marriage. And so there's the issue of the dowry, the marriage dowry that hasn't been paid. And David wasn't a rich man, so Saul says this, he says, how about, this is part of his plan, how about you bring me 100 of my enemies, 100 dead Philistines, and we'll call that the dowry. And Saul's hope was that the Philistines would do his dirty work for him and kill David. David brings back 200 of them and says, here you go, Saul. Everything that Saul tried to do to get rid of David, every plot Saul tried to hatch to get rid of David, the Lord protected David. And again, this is such a sad story, because what happened here is that Saul's focus shifted from turning away to killing and freeing themselves from their real enemies, which were the Philistines. The real threat, the real enemy of Israel was the Philistines. Saul's focus shifted from dealing with that to the only goal that he had in life, the only job, the only focus that he had as his kingship was to kill David. To kill David. That was the only thing that Saul had on his mind. How am I going to get rid of David? Forget about the Philistines. Forget about how they're raiding our villages and capturing our people. How am I going to kill David? That became the focus of the rest of Saul's life. I want you just to point out here just a couple of things. And the first is in verse 13 of chapter 18. And this is just such a wonderful verse. I love this. This is actually back up to verse 12. Chapter 18, verse 12. It says this. Now Saul was afraid of David. Saul was actually afraid of David. You know why Saul was afraid of David? It says there in the next sentence. For the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul. Saul was afraid because Saul knew that the Lord was with David. And Saul was afraid because he knew, based on things that had happened in previous chapters, that the Lord was no longer with him. He didn't give him guidance, he didn't give him instruction, he didn't walk with him. That's why he hated David, or one of the reasons, because he knew the Lord was with him. This says, therefore Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. So David is given a post. And I just love verse 15. It says, when Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, he dreaded him. When Saul saw that David was prospering greatly, when Saul saw that everything that David did benefited Israel as a whole, benefited the nation as a whole, he dreaded it because he disliked David so much. And in fact, he would rather have David come in and announce, yeah, we lost that war. We lost people. Things didn't go as planned. But rather than come in and announce good news about what was happening on the military front, because he dreaded him so much. He just wanted to see him suffer. He wanted to see him fail. He wanted to see him, not do as well as David was doing. One of the things that can lead us and that can sort of make envy very obvious in our lives, sometimes it's hard to sort of pick out, is simply this. When you are happy, when you rejoice, when you are celebrating, nobody does this out loud, by the way, because someone is going through a hard time, because someone is suffering, because somebody is going through a financial loss and you don't like them. When you are celebrating the struggles of other people, that is when you know that you have a problem with envy. When you would rather see other people fail because it makes you feel good, because it makes you feel like you're more of a man or more of a woman, when it makes you feel like you're more of a success because someone else is not doing as well as they were at one time, that is one of the ways that you know that you have a problem with envy. And it always starts so subtly. It always starts with a little song, with a little conversation, with a little comment. And again, nobody, we don't make these things obvious in our lives. We sign the card, hope you get well soon, put a little smiley face on it. We go to great lengths to hide these things in our lives because we know if people could see through us, if people could see how we really felt, it would be embarrassing. And people would think less of us. We go to great lengths to hide these things, but it always starts so subtly. And left unchecked, and left undealt with, and left, without someone coming in and talking to us and saying, what's going on here? What's happening? Why are you acting this way? Envy, jealousy is one of those things that just could begin as a seed, and the next thing you know, it is just completely out of control. And it's grown to like a tree this size with branches going every direction, and it just becomes a very, very dark place in our lives. And pretty soon, like Saul, we can be consumed. Our whole thoughts, our whole lives can be consumed with making sure that we are better, more successful, that we look better on paper than him or her, that making sure someone else fails or suffers because it makes us feel better, look better. That's envy. And Saul, even though it was good for the nation, good for Israel, good for his kingship, good for everything, he just dreaded so much when David brought him good news because he'd rather see David bring bad news and say, you know what, Saul, I failed today. Yes. There's a story in the New Testament, and many of you know this story. It's about John the Baptist. I've probably talked about it before in a sermon or two. And John the Baptist was a forerunner to Jesus. John the Baptist came on the scene, and he actually amassed quite a following. Quite a few people would go to hear John speak and would respond to John's word. And John was out in the desert, and people would wander and travel long distances to hear John speak. And there came a time that as Jesus came on the scene, as Jesus kind of began his own ministry, Jesus was a more powerful speaker than John. And John's following, John's people started to sort of dwindle a little bit because people were more interested and more excited to hear and to see what miracles Jesus would do than to hear what John the Baptist had to say. And so John maybe had 1,000 at his first sermon, and then a month or two later, maybe it was 700, and then, maybe a year or two later, down to 150 or 200. And there came a time where a bunch of John's really core, loyal followers, they weren't ever going to leave this guy, came to him and they said, John, I'm paraphrasing here, if you notice the trend, have you noticed sort of what's happening? Jesus, this new guy, is taking off your followers. Jesus is with his speaking ability and with his miracles and the way he connects with people, they are leaving you and they are going over with Jesus. And we have a real problem here because fundraising's down, John, and all this kind of stuff. Again, paraphrasing. And you know what John's response was to that? You know what John said? He said to his followers, he said this, he says, he must increase, but I must decrease. Now that is powerful. He must increase, but I must decrease. And what John knew is simply this, that Jesus was always to be the one that people were to follow. That as much as it was nice for John to have a lot of people there, and John just kept trying to point people to Jesus and point people to the one that was to come soon, and that person did come. And John just knew from the start that his ministry wasn't about him. It wasn't about how many people showed up. It wasn't about how many people followed him. He knew that his purpose in life was that eventually the role of Christ and the ministry of Christ would increase, and that as Christ increased, John's would sort of fade into the background. John would decrease. He must increase. But I, John says, must decrease. You know what the antidote to envy and jealousy and pride and those things are so often so interconnected? You know what the antidote, you know what the way to deal with that is? The quickest, and I should say that is a very painful way to deal with it, is simply this: humility. Humility. It's that we consistently, time and time again, put other people, other people's gifts, other people's ministries, other people's abilities, that instead of drawing all the attention to us and what we can do, we keep putting that attention and spotlight on other people, saying, look how God is using them, look how God is growing their faith. The antidote to envy and jealousy is humility, where we say, you know what? It's not all about me. It's not all about my kingship. It's not all about my ability. And that we thrust other people in positions where they can thrive, and that God can use them in powerful, powerful ways. Because if we don't do that, if we don't practice humility, if we don't keep putting others in the limelight, if we don't keep directing people to Jesus and reminding ourselves that it's not all about us, eventually we become angry. Eventually we become jealous. Eventually we become envious of those and the success of those around us. And if we don't watch out, pretty soon it will consume everything that we are, and it will destroy us. He must increase. I must decrease. So, this is what you can do. There's lots of ways that you can practice humility. And you know, if you think about it for a few moments, I'm sure that you will think of some for your own life and your own sort of situations. This is what I want you to do, though, is that when you find yourselves, and it's funny, I'll just sort of say this, okay, just a couple minutes left. A few weeks ago, just after I preached the first message, when we were talking about envy and jealousy and comparison, I had a conversation with someone like that next week, and they were telling me about some things that were happening in their church, and I was like, oh man, that is so exciting. And there's this part of me that was like, you know what? I just wish that was happening here, because it was really cool. And I wish that God was doing that here. And then I'm thinking to myself, you know, Brent, probably not a good attitude, just after you talked about that. And you know, it's ugly. And you know, the thing that we can do, the thing that we can practice, the thing that we can keep saying over and over, just to remind ourselves, not to get ahead of ourselves too much, is simply this. Next time you find yourself in a situation where you want to compare, where you're jealous or envious of someone else's success, someone else's ability, something else someone is doing, just repeat these words over and over, and it will help you. It says, I must increase, he must decrease. Will you say that with me? I must increase, he must decrease. Okay, I got it backwards, okay? That's not good. Say that over and over. Okay, so, he must increase, I must decrease. He must increase, I must decrease. Folks, humility. That's the only way that we can deal with envy and jealousy in our lives. Let's pray together this morning. Father God, I think sometimes we fail to understand just how much these seemingly little things in our lives can take on a mind of their own and begin to change us into people that we don't want to be, into people that you don't want us to be. Lord, help us to celebrate with honesty in our hearts the success of the people that you have placed alongside of us in our churches, in our workplaces. Lord, help us to honor you with an attitude of humility in our lives. Lord, that we would constantly be putting others first, that we would constantly be placing the spotlight on others to highlight what you are doing through them. And Lord, that the seed of jealousy might just be rooted out or not find room at all in our hearts. hearts. Lord, remind us that you are the one that must always increase. And Lord, that we must be decreasing constantly. Lord, we thank you for these things. We do pray them in your name. Amen. We're going to sing a song at this time, so I would invite you to sing our closing song. That is He Knows Our Names. So let's stand together and sing this morning.